In Live on Live this Thursday, I'm joined in the studio by former US political attaché to Syria, William Jordan. And today we're going to take a look at last weekend's suspected chemical attack on the town of Douma on the outskirts of Damascus. And, of course, the international reaction to that alleged massacre as the US and Russia are facing off over how to respond. William, it's great to have you back on the programme again.
Well, thanks, you, David.
Now, let's have a look here. What are the options for the United States in response to this chemical attack that Trump himself seems to now have backed down from?
Well, simply put, I mean, the first thing he could do is a limited strike like he did last year when there was a similar incident. That, as everybody, including myself, congratulated Trump for having not so much responded, but having responded in a very punctual, limited, and simple way. I mean, it was a very much, I always said it was very much like an Israeli strike. You know, it was out of the blue, done, over with. None of the stuff that was talked about back in 2013 when everybody was facing the consequences of crossing Barack Obama's red line.
That was 2012, indeed. Yes.
Yeah, where there was going to be a full-scale carpet bombing of parts of the the Syrian air defense and command and control structure.
Yes.
Something that would last several days. Now we're sort of faced with the situation where, okay, a year later, what do you do? The feeling very much in Washington is the one-off strike didn't work. Well, and so it's going to have to be something much more like was first evoked back in 2013, a broader, days-long, possibly, campaign.
And of course, I mean, we'll look back at that strike, which was almost a year ago. It's really around this time last year. But there were 60-odd missiles that were thrown onto this airbase. Very few casualties. They were given the heads up before before the strikes actually happened. So, I mean, this is limited strikes, and it's kind of a low-cost, low-risk kind of option that they're throwing out there. But let's look at the high-risk option, which would have to be going above and beyond the Russian and Iranian involvement in the conflict, and, like as you said, maybe carpet bombing, really targeting Syrian government installations, if you will. But the big risk here is the Russians, even and their planes with the Syrians, are deeply embedded with the Syrians at the moment, with their forces. So this would just be a recipe for disaster, wouldn't it?
And that's the message that the Russians are sending back. I mean, their ambassador in Lebanon made very clear that the United States should not expect, anybody else should not expect that this will just happen and, either Russia or the Syrians will just will not put up a fight, will not defend in any way, and may even go after the sources of the attacks in the first place.
And apparently, some of the ships in the Mediterranean, the U.S. Ships out there, have been buzzed by Russian jets, I've heard.
Yeah, although that's been going on for a while in various contexts around the world, where the Russians have been wanting to play sort of these Cold War type games of testing the limits of nerve on the part of the West.
Sure.
You know, so it's I don't know how much of that is directly related to this. Obviously, in the current context, if it's happening today, if it's happening in the in the next few days, it's very much directly related to that. It's clearly laying down the message. There's a line here. You've set down a line. You think we've crossed. Well, we're going to set down a line that we warn you not to cross.
Sure. Sure. Now, let's have a look at the options. The other option is that there's no military intervention on behalf of the United States. What, in that case, is the correct response to the use of chemical weapons that Bashar al-Assad and his regime said that they had got rid of 5 years ago?
That's a question that actually should be discussed with greater seriousness and with a greater desire to try to do what happened in 2013, which is to find a way out at the Security Council. I mean, we are in the situation, a very Cold War type situation, where the U.S. and Russia are basically standing off against each other, refusing to accept the other's proposals. But I am of the firm belief, as I was in 2013, that the use of chemical weapons, horrific and terrible as it is not really what should be bringing everything to a head as far as significant and major military action. Let's make no mistake, David. This is an act of war that the United States is planning to perpetrate on Syria. with possible side consequence that the Russians would be directly drawn in. So I think that, cooler heads, as it were, need to prevail, taking into account that the actual number of casualties, again, I don't want to diminish the suffering of the people who've gone through these chemical attacks, but in terms of the way the Syrian regime has conducted this war, the brutality that it has inflicted upon innocent people, whether through barrel bombings, targeting civilian infrastructure, hospitals and schools and that sort of thing, the relentless violence with which the Syrian army has been willing to inflict upon the people to carry out its struggle, the chemical weapons issue, it's important, but it should be sort of verified, and in my view, the facts need to be established before you figure out what you do next.
Now, William, picking up from that point, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons they will go in, they've been invited in to actually find proof, and they're not there to point fingers, they're just there to find proof if chemical weapons were used, banned chemical weapons. But the one point is, can they prove who deployed those chemical weapons?
I think they can, and I think they did in 2013, particularly with the strikes that were in Ghouta. I know there were several other things, and they were able to trace back the chemicals used in certain earlier suspected attacks by the regime to the same chemicals used in Ghouta. So yes, they can. What you just mentioned is a very key issue in terms of what the Security Council came to an impasse over, which is the ability of the OPCW to literally point fingers by saying, okay, we have the evidence that shows that from our analysis, the Syrian regime carried out these attacks. I think that's going to be moving forward. The crux of a lot of this, the OPCW can go in, it can conduct tests, it can sort of determine the nature of the attacks, but what in the end you want to do is you want to reach a conclusion as to who likely carried them out.
Indeed, that being the main point.
Right.
Now, let's move on from this. There was a very interesting interview that I heard yesterday from the former UK ambassador to Syria, a gentleman known as called Peter Ford, who warned against knee-jerk hysteria in reaction to the images of the alleged attack that took place in Douma. Indeed, there is the ratcheting up of all this rhetoric. Twitter diplomacy has now become kind of the latest buzzword. But he alluded to the pictures coming out of that attack from Douma, saying, well, who exactly are the sources of information here? He cited the Syrian American Medical Society, the first responders, known as the White Helmets, and he tarred them with a very different brush, saying, well, these guys are funded by, jihadist operations or Islamist operations. The counterclaims say that the attack itself was staged. Would it be in the interests of the people there to actually stage this attack, to actually provoke a larger involvement from the West in the conflict?
It would be in the interests of the opposition groups, the rebel groups that are sort of operating there, sure. But I don't want to point fingers, and I don't want to cast aspersions or accusations against generally well-meaning volunteers who are in very trying circumstances, attempting to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of all of these people. But I would say that there's no question that because of the imagery, the impact of the imagery that's out there, that this is revived just the same sort of not hysterical reaction, but certainly the sharp reaction that occurred in 2013. And I might add, was similar to the reaction that preceded the 2011 intervention in Libya, that many people point to as having had a disastrous outcome, mostly because, as we all know, it went beyond the limited aims that were sort of prescribed for it initially and became something more that was dedicated to bringing down the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. And look at where Libya is today. This is the risk that, again, presents itself in Syria.
Now, we touched on Twitter diplomacy there earlier, but for a final question that follows, I think, nicely from your reply there, have Western leaders overly personalized this issue, particularly in France and the United States?
I think they have. And I think that in France in particular, I'm always amazed at how easily people go back to the 2013 episode as somehow representing a great betrayal, a personal betrayal of François Hollande, the president at the time. and how Emmanuel Macron has made very clear he's not going to find himself in that same situation again. Donald Trump's, entirely incoherent and bizarre, timeline of reactions to all of the various things, going back to 2013, the mixed signals he's constantly sent about how the United States regards the Assad regime or Russia, inevitably, how do I put it? It scrambles, whatever it is that is going on, and it makes clear that what's happening is that there's more of a visceral and gut reaction to all of this than a careful, thoughtful, and important reaction, that would seem to be commensurate with the gravity of the situation. The use of chemical weapons, as I said, is horrific, and it's banned by international law. But to take, to feel like the only recourse that you have is to take massive military action in response is arguably an overreaction going well beyond what is immediately needed.
Okay, William Jordan, my thanks for coming into the studio talking to us today.
My pleasure.
William Jordan, former US political attaché to Syria, speaking there with me, David Coffey, here on Live this Thursday afternoon. Well, from all the team here, have a great day. Back tomorrow at the same time. Bye-bye.